The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. I am Vex Ordain, Communications Officer of the Concord, listening post Halvorn Reach, and in the 3 years I have served on this station, I had never heard that particular alarm before. It was not the tone for a pirate raid. It was not the tone for a reactor failure. It was a tone I had only read about in training manuals, filed under a category so rare that most officers forget it exists. Unscheduled human vessel, weapons active, no hail received. I remember gripping the edge of my console with both hands, my knuckles paling under my skin, and thinking, quite stupidly, that there must be some mistake. Humans did not arrive without a hail. Humans were the most predictable species in known space. They filed flight plans 3 days in advance. They apologized when their shadow crossed your doorway. They were, by every measure my people had ever used to judge a civilization, polite to the point of exhaustion. That was the joke among us, back when we still made jokes about them. The tame ones, the gentle giants. A species that had clawed its way up from a world so violent that simply surviving to adulthood was considered an achievement, and yet here they were in Concord space, saying please and thank you, and filling out forms in triplicate. We used to laugh about it in the mess hall. Imagine, we said, evolving to survive alongside creatures that could tear a starship hull open with their bare claws, and then coming here to say sorry for taking up too much space at the negotiating table. I did not know then that the joke had a shelf life. I did not know that we had all been standing very close to something enormous, mistaking its stillness for its true shape. The tactical display in front of me resolved the contact a few seconds later, and my breath caught somewhere behind my ribs. A single vessel, human hull configuration, matte gray, unmarked except for a small insignia near the bow that translated roughly to longbow. No fleet designation, no registered flight plan. It had simply appeared at the edge of our sensor net, decelerating from a velocity that should have torn its hull apart, and it was now sitting exactly 400 kilometers from Halvorn Reach, with every weapon system powered and aimed at absolutely nothing in particular, which was somehow more unsettling than if it had aimed at us directly. Commander Isbeth Taro arrived on the bridge, with her uniform half-fastened, her pale grey eyes already scanning every screen at once. She was Dravith, like me, from the deep continent clans, and she had survived 2 border conflicts before she ever set foot on this station. I had seen her calm in situations that would have made lesser officers weep. I had never seen her afraid. She was afraid now. I could tell by the way she stood very still, the way Dravith stand when a predator is close enough to smell but not yet close enough to see. "Hail them," she said. Standard Concord greeting protocol. Full diplomatic courtesy. I had already tried. 3 times, in fact, cycling through every frequency our species used for first contact, and follow-up contact, and emergency contact. Nothing came back. Not silence exactly, because silence would have meant the channel was open and simply unanswered. This was different. This was a channel that opened, registered our signal, and then closed again, as if something on the other end had looked at our greeting, considered it, and decided it was not worth a response. "They're receiving us," I told her. "They're just not answering." Taro's jaw tightened. "Try their language directly. Skip the translation matrix. Sometimes the older ones prefer plain speech." I switched channels and spoke into the console myself, my mouth shaping the harsh, clipped syllables of Terran Standard, the way I had been trained to, carefully, respectfully, the way you might speak to an elder whose patience you did not wish to test. "Human vessel Longbow, this is Concord listening post Halvorn Reach. We register your arrival without a filed flight plan, and without response to hailing protocols. Please confirm your intentions. We welcome you and wish only to ensure the safety of all parties in this sector." There was a pause. A long one, long enough that I began to wonder if the channel had failed entirely, if perhaps the equipment on their end was simply old or damaged, if this might all resolve into some mundane technical explanation that would let all of us breathe again. Then a voice came through, and it was not what I expected. It was calm, it was almost gentle, in the way a parent's voice is gentle when explaining something difficult to a child for the last time. "Halvorn Reach, this is Longbow Actual. We hear you. We are not here to negotiate. and we are not here to be welcomed. We are here to observe. Maintain your current heading and your current behavior, and nothing about your day will change. Longbow out. The channel closed. I sat there with my hands still hovering over the console, and for a long moment, nobody on the bridge said anything at all. Taro finally broke the silence, and her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "Pull every record we have on that ship's captain," she said, "and get me a line to the Concord Council, now." It took 11 minutes to identify him. His name was Daniel Cole, and according to our records he had served the Concord for 6 years as a liaison officer, attached to 3 different diplomatic missions, decorated twice for what our reports described as exceptional patience under provocation. I remembered him vaguely, a tall man with dark hair and a quiet way of speaking, the kind of human who apologized for interrupting even when he had waited politely for someone else to finish an entire sentence. I remembered thinking he was unremarkable, in the way that background furniture is unremarkable, present and useful and never quite noticed. The man who had spoken to us over that channel did not sound unremarkable. He sounded like something that had been wearing a costume for 6 years and had just taken it off. I want to explain, before I go further, exactly how strange this was for those of us who had grown up under Concord doctrine. We are taught from childhood that civilization is a ladder, and that species climb it slowly, shedding violence and impulse as they rise, the way a snake sheds an old skin it has outgrown. We believed, without ever questioning it, that a species which behaved gently had become gentle, that politeness was evidence of a settled nature, that if a species said sorry enough times, it meant sorry all the way down. Humanity had said sorry more than any species we had ever recorded. They apologized for arriving early to meetings. They apologized for disagreeing, even when they were right and everyone else was wrong. They apologized, I once heard, for accidentally saving a Concord vessel from a mining collapse, because their rescue method had involved detonating a controlled explosive that startled the crew they were saving. An entire species built almost entirely out of overcorrection, out of careful, deliberate gentleness, layered so thick that none of us ever thought to ask what it was covering. I thought about all of this while Taro spoke to the council, her voice pitched low so the rest of the bridge crew would not panic. I watched the tactical display instead, watched the small grey dot that was Longbow sitting motionless in the dark, weapons live, engines cold, waiting for something none of us could name. It was 3 days later that we learned what had happened to the convoy. I first heard about it the way most of the station heard about it, second-hand, through a report that arrived garbled and incomplete on the emergency relay. A human civilian convoy, 17 vessels, had been moving through a stretch of neutral space near the Kesh boundary, escorted by 2 lightly armed patrol craft, carrying colonists and medical supplies to one of the newer human settlements. According to the report, a Crintal squadron had intercepted them under the pretense of a routine cargo inspection, a common enough occurrence in that contested region, and something during that inspection had gone catastrophically wrong. The details that followed were the kind that made the recycled air in the station feel suddenly too thin to breathe. 3 of the convoy vessels did not survive the encounter. The official Crintal statement called it a tragic miscalculation during a security procedure. The human response, released through official channels less than 6 hours later, was so measured, so calm, so utterly without anger, that it unsettled me more than any declaration of war could have. Humanity requested a formal tribunal. They asked for an independent Concord investigation. They stated, in careful diplomatic language, that they trusted the process, that they believed in the rule of law that bound our shared space together, and that they would await the outcome with patience. The Concord Council praised them for it. I remember the broadcast, remember the chair of the council, a Velmiri elder, with iridescent skin and a voice like rustling paper, speaking about humanity's exemplary restraint, holding them up as a model for how a young species should conduct itself among elders. Humanity has grown so much, the chair said. They have learned to set aside the instincts of their difficult origins and embrace the wisdom of civilized conduct. I remember thinking, at the time, that this was a good thing. I remember feeling something like pride on their behalf, the strange, second-hand pride you feel when a friend does something admirable. It was Ethan Cross who told me otherwise, and Ethan was the closest thing I had to a human friend on that station. He had transferred to Halvorn Reach 8 months earlier as part of a joint liaison program, a broad-shouldered man with sandy hair and an easy laugh that had always made the long shifts pass faster. We had shared meals together. He had taught me a card game from his childhood, and I had taught him the proper way to brew Dravith tea, which he insisted on drinking far too hot. He stopped laughing after the convoy. I noticed it before I understood it, the way you notice a light has dimmed before you notice the bulb has changed. He still spoke to me. He still ate in the mess hall at the same hours, but something behind his eyes had gone quiet in a way that made the hair on my arms rise whenever I looked at him directly. I asked him about it 3 days after the news broke, sitting across from him in the mostly empty mess hall, the recycled lighting casting long shadows across the table between us. "You seem different," I said, because I did not know a more careful way to say it. He did not answer right away. He turned his cup of coffee slowly in his hands, watching the dark liquid inside, as if it might tell him something. "We already asked nicely 3 times, he said finally. I did not understand what he meant, not then. I asked him to explain, and he only shook his head, gave me a smile that did not reach anywhere near his eyes, and changed the subject to something meaningless, something about the maintenance schedule for the water reclamation system. I let it go, because that is what you do with a friend who is grieving, or angry, or something else entirely that you do not yet have a word for. You let them set the pace. I did not know, sitting there in that quiet mess hall with my tea going cold, that I was watching the last few days of a performance that had lasted longer than my entire life. I did not know that somewhere far beyond our sensor range, on worlds and stations and ships scattered across human territory, other officers just like Ethan were having the exact same conversation, wearing the exact same expression, folding the exact same careful mask back into a drawer they had hoped never to open again. I only knew that something had shifted, in a way I could not name and did not yet fully fear. The convoy attack should have provoked outrage. It should have provoked the kind of furious diplomatic exchange that filled Concord archives whenever 2 species disagreed over territory or resources. Instead, it produced silence, careful statements, patient requests for due process, and a council that congratulated humanity for its restraint, as if restraint were the entire story, rather than merely its cover. Taro called an all-officer briefing 4 days after the Longbow's arrival, and I remember the tension in that room the way you remember the pressure before a storm, a weight in the air that made everyone speak a little too carefully, a little too quietly. "The Council has requested we maintain full observation of the Longbow and file continuous reports," she told us, standing at the head of the briefing table with her hands clasped behind her back. "They have also requested we avoid any action that could be construed as provocation." "Meaning what, exactly?" asked one of the junior officers, a young Velmiri named Corin, who had only been assigned to the station for a few months and had not yet learned to fear the things the rest of us feared. "We wait. We do not hail them again unless they hail us first." I glanced toward the small viewport at the edge of the briefing room, though of course I could not see the Longbow from there, could not see anything except the same unchanging field of distant stars we saw every day. Somewhere out there it sat, engines cold, weapons live, and I found myself wondering what exactly it was waiting to observe. I got a partial answer that night, though I did not recognize it as an answer at the time. Ethan found me in the observation deck, a narrow curved room near the top of the station where the viewport stretched nearly floor to ceiling, offering an unobstructed view of the black between the stars. I went there sometimes when I could not sleep, and apparently so did he. He sat down beside me without asking, which was unusual for him, because humans, as a rule, asked permission for nearly everything, another one of the small habits that had made me trust them so completely over the years. "Can I tell you something?" he said, "and you won't repeat it to your commander?" I hesitated, because loyalty to my post was not a small thing to set aside, even for a friend, but something in his voice made the hesitation feel foolish, made it feel like withholding comfort from someone drowning simply because you were worried about the paperwork. "You can tell me," I said. He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the stars, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, the voice of a man reciting something he had rehearsed many times in his own head, but never said aloud. "You know how everyone always says humans are the gentle ones," he said. "The ones who learn to behave. You know that story." "I know that story," I said. "I have believed that story most of my life." "It was never a story about becoming gentle," he said. "It was a story about deciding to be. There's a difference, and it matters more than you think." He turned to look at me then, and his eyes, usually so warm, so easy, held something in them that I had never seen in a human face before, something old and heavy, and entirely without cruelty, and somehow that made it worse. We didn't forget what we came from. We just agreed, a long time ago, that we wouldn't bring it here unless we had no other choice left. "And now?" I asked, though some part of me already dreaded the answer. He looked back out at the stars, and his jaw tightened just slightly, the way Taro's had when the longbow first arrived, the way I imagine every steady creature's jaw tightens right before it stops being steady. "Now we're running out of choices," he said. "And I don't think anyone out here is ready for what happens after that." We sat there together for a long while after that, neither of us speaking, the stars unmoving and patient above us, indifferent to whatever was quietly gathering weight just beyond the edges of what either of us could see. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake instead, turning his words over and over, trying to fit them into everything I thought I understood about the gentle, apologetic species that had spent 6 years teaching me to trust them completely. I did not yet understand that trust and truth were not always the same thing, and that I was about to learn the difference in a way no briefing, no doctrine, and no lifetime of Concord teaching could have possibly prepared me for. The longbow remained at its post for the next several days, silent, motionless, and utterly unmoved by every attempt we made to draw it into conversation. I watched its position on the tactical display more times than I could count, half expecting it to vanish as suddenly as it had appeared, half expecting it to finally answer one of our hails with some explanation that would let the tightness in my chest finally loosen. Neither thing happened. It simply waited the way a held breath waits, and somewhere deep in my instincts, in whatever ancient part of my Dravith mind still remembered what it meant to sense a predator nearby without seeing it clearly, I understood that the waiting was the point. It was not indecision. It was not hesitation. It was patience with teeth, and I did not yet know what would happen when that patience finally ran out. I would find out soon enough, and so would the rest of the galaxy, though none of us understood it yet as anything other than the quiet, uneasy calm that settles just before every storm any of us have ever lived through. The summons came 11 days after the longbow first appeared, and it arrived not through the usual diplomatic channels, but through a direct priority relay from the Concord Council itself, which told me, before I even opened the message, that whatever was happening had grown too large for a single listening post to contain. I was assigned, along with Commander Taro, to accompany a delegation to Sindral Station, the largest neutral meeting ground in this region of space, where representatives of the Concord, the Crintal hegemony, and a small human delegation were to convene for what the official notice called an Emergency Clarification Summit. I remember reading that phrase 3 times before I understood what it meant, Clarification Summit, as if what had happened to that convoy was a matter of confusion rather than consequence. Sindral Station was unlike anything at Halvorn Reach. It rose out of the dark like a cathedral built by a dozen different species arguing over the blueprint, its corridors a patchwork of Velmiri crystal architecture, Dravith stone paneling, and human steel reinforcement beams bolted in wherever structural integrity mattered more than aesthetics. I had visited twice before in my career, both times for minor trade disputes that had resolved themselves within a day. This time the air itself felt different, the moment I stepped off the transport, thick with a tension that pressed against my chest like a physical weight. I noticed the Crintal delegation first, because they were impossible not to notice. Tall, armored even in formal settings, their chitinous plating catching the light in dull greenish flashes, they moved through the station with the confident swagger of a species that had never once, in living memory, been made to answer for anything. Their lead negotiator, a broad-shouldered officer named Vosk Ren, wore an expression of practiced boredom that I recognized instantly because I had seen it before in every diplomatic exchange where one side believed itself untouchable. The human delegation arrived nearly an hour later, and I remember the room growing quieter when they did, though I could not have said exactly why at the time. There were only 4 of them. A senior diplomat named Laura Bennett, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, flanked by 2 military attachés, whose names I would later learn were Grace Bishop and Nathan Brooks, and a 4th figure, who stood slightly apart from the others, dressed not in the crisp formal attire of the diplomatic corps, but in the simple gray uniform of a fleet officer. I recognized him from the reports, Daniel Cole, the man whose voice had told us over a closing channel that he was not there to be welcomed. He did not speak during the opening session. He simply stood near the back of the human delegation, hands folded behind him, watching the room the way a teacher watches a classroom full of children who do not yet know they are about to be tested. The session itself unfolded exactly as I had feared it would. Voskren presented the Krintal account of the convoy incident with a flat, unhurried confidence, describing it as an unfortunate escalation caused by human vessels failing to comply with standard inspection procedures in a timely manner. He used the word regrettable 4 times. He never once used the word responsible. I watched Laura Bennett's face as she listened, and I expected anger, or at least the visible strain of anger, held carefully in check. Instead, I saw something closer to weariness, the particular exhaustion of someone listening to an excuse they have heard many times before, dressed up in slightly different words each time. "We have reviewed your account," she said when it was her turn to speak, her voice calm and clear enough to carry to every corner of the chamber. "We have also reviewed the sensor logs recovered from the convoy's surviving escort vessel, which directly contradict several elements of your report. We are prepared to submit those logs to independent Concord review." Voskren's mandibles clicked together in a gesture I had learned, over the years, to associate with Krintal amusement. "Sensor logs can be damaged in the chaos of an inspection," he said. "We would caution against drawing conclusions from incomplete data." "The data is not incomplete," Bennett said. "It is simply inconvenient." A ripple of tension moved through the chamber at that, the kind of tension that comes when someone finally says a true thing out loud, in a room that has been carefully avoiding it. I glanced toward the human delegation, and saw that Daniel Cole had not moved at all, had not so much as shifted his weight, but something in the set of his shoulders had changed, some subtle tightening that made me think, absurdly, of a bowstring being drawn back 1 careful centimeter at a time. The session continued for nearly 3 hours, circling the same ground again and again, the Krintal delegation offering variations of the same denial, the human delegation responding with the same patient, measured insistence on process and evidence. I had sat through enough Concord negotiations to recognize the rhythm of it, the slow grinding machinery of diplomacy that eventually, given enough time, ground even the hardest disputes down into something resembling resolution. What I did not recognize, because I had never seen it before, was the moment when that rhythm broke. It happened near the end of the session, when the council's presiding officer, a Velmiri elder named Ail Sorinth, attempted to summarize the proceedings in the careful, diplomatic language that Concord doctrine required. She spoke of the need for patience, for continued investigation, for both parties to exercise restraint while the matter was properly examined through established channels. She spoke, in other words, exactly the way every Concord official had spoken about every dispute I had ever witnessed, and I expected the human delegation to accept it the way they always did, with quiet nods and careful diplomatic language of their own. Instead, Daniel Cole stepped forward. He had not been given the floor. He had not been recognized by the presiding officer. And yet something about the way he moved made every voice in that chamber fall silent before he had even spoken a single word. The way a room falls silent, not because it has been asked to, but because some older instinct in every creature present recognizes that whatever comes next deserves to be heard clearly. "With respect," he said, and his voice was quiet, almost gentle, in a way that made it somehow more unsettling than shouting would have been. We have exercised restraint for 6 years. We have submitted every grievance through established channels. We have absorbed every so-called regrettable incident with patience, because we were told that patience was the price of belonging here, and we paid it gladly, because we believed belonging was worth the price. He paused, and in that pause I heard something shift in the air of the chamber, a pressure change so subtle I could not have named it if asked, but which every creature in that room felt regardless of species or language. We are no longer certain that belief was correct, he said, and we will not be submitting any further grievances through this process. Aelsorinth's pale skin flushed a faint shade of violet, the Velmiri equivalent of alarm. Officer Cole, this is not the appropriate venue for... I understand it is not the appropriate venue, Cole said, and his tone did not rise, did not sharpen, remained exactly as calm as it had been from the first word. I am telling you regardless, because I believe you deserve to hear it directly, rather than through a formal notice, delivered after the fact. Humanity has spent a great deal of effort convincing this council that we have learned to set aside the instincts of our origin. I would ask you to consider, carefully, what it might mean if that effort has simply reached the end of what it was able to accomplish. He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture. He simply turned and walked back to stand beside Laura Bennett, and the silence that followed him stretched long enough that I found myself holding a breath I had not realized I was holding. Vosk Wren broke the silence first, and his tone carried the particular arrogance of a creature that has mistaken discomfort in a room for weakness in an opponent. Are we to understand this as a threat? He asked, mandibles clicking with something close to delight. The gentle humans, finally showing their claws. Cole did not look at him directly. He looked instead at Aelsorinth, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the same terrible, quiet calm. We do not make threats, he said. We make observations, and then we make decisions. The observation is that patience without consequence is simply an invitation for the pattern to continue. The decision has not yet been made. I would encourage everyone in this room to consider what might help us decide it favorably, and to consider it quickly. The summit ended shortly after that, without resolution, without agreement, without even the customary closing statements that usually soften the edges of a difficult negotiation. I remember walking back toward the transport bay beside Taro, both of us silent, both of us turning the same unanswerable question over in our minds. Did you see his face? Taro said finally, once we were far enough from the chamber that no one else could hear. When he spoke, did you see it? I had seen it. I had seen the particular stillness of a creature that has already decided something and is simply waiting for the rest of the universe to catch up to that decision, and I found that I could not stop thinking about it, could not stop replaying the moment when the calm, gentle, apologetic species I had known for years had, in the space of a single quiet sentence, revealed the outline of something enormous, standing just behind the curtain of its own restraint. It was on the transport back to Halvorn Reach that Ethan finally told me the rest of it, though I had to ask 3 times before he agreed to speak. There's a term we use, he said, staring at the small viewport beside his seat, rather than at me. Back home, in the old training doctrine, controlled variable, that's what we call ourselves, when we're being honest about it in the rooms where honesty is allowed. I don't understand, I said. When we first started meeting other species, he said, there were people in our command structure, a long time ago, who looked at what we came from, what we survived, what we're capable of when we stop holding back, and they made a decision. They decided that if humanity was going to be part of a larger community of worlds, we needed rules. Not rules imposed by anyone else, rules we imposed on ourselves, because nobody else out here would have been able to enforce them on us, even if they tried. He finally looked at me, and his eyes held that same old, heavy weight I had seen the night we sat together on the observation deck. We've spent decades convincing ourselves those rules were permanent, he said. Convincing everyone else that the version of us you've been dealing with is the only version there is. But rules like that were never meant to survive contact with something that kept testing them, over and over, to see how far they could be pushed before they broke. And now they're breaking, I said quietly. Ethan did not answer right away. He turned back to the viewport, watching the stars slide past in long silver streaks, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Now we're finding out whether they were ever really rules at all," he said, "or just a very long, very patient way of asking the rest of you to give us a reason not to need them." I did not sleep again that night, nor the night after. I lay awake instead in my narrow quarters, listening to the low hum of the station's systems, thinking about a species that had spent 6 years teaching an entire galaxy to trust its gentleness, and wondering, with a dread I could not fully name, what exactly we were all about to learn about the difference between a species that had never known violence and a species that had simply chosen, every single day for longer than most of us had been alive, not to use it. I did not have to wonder for very much longer. The answer arrived less than a week later, and it arrived without warning, without ceremony, and without the smallest trace of the patience that had defined every human interaction I had ever witnessed. The message that changed everything did not come through the tactical relay, and it did not come through any diplomatic channel at all. It came through the open civilian frequency, the one used for weather advisories and shipping notices, and the 1,000 small mundane announcements that kept the ordinary business of the sector running, and that alone told me something had shifted so completely that whoever sent it no longer cared who else might be listening. I was on shift when it arrived, seated at my usual console, with a cup of tea gone cold beside me, and I remember the strange flatness of the voice that came through the speakers, a voice with none of the careful diplomatic warmth I had grown used to hearing from human broadcasts. "This is a general notice to all vessels and installations within the Kesh boundary corridor," the voice said. It was not Daniel Cole. It was a woman's voice, calm and clipped, reading from what sounded like a prepared statement rather than speaking freely. "Effective immediately, all Crintal hegemony military assets within this corridor are to consider themselves under active observation by human forces. This is not a request for compliance. This is a notice of intent." The message repeated twice more, in 3 different languages, and then went silent, leaving behind a stillness in the communications bay that felt heavier than the noise had been. Commander Taro arrived within minutes, summoned by the same broadcast that had summoned every officer on duty, and she stood beside my console, reading the transcript over my shoulder, with an expression I had rarely seen on her face before, something between disbelief and a very old, very familiar dread. "Notice of intent," she repeated quietly. "That's not diplomatic language. That's not even military language, not the kind we've heard from them before. That's a warning shot, fired with words instead of weapons." I did not fully understand what she meant until 4 hours later, when the first reports began arriving from deeper inside the Kesh boundary corridor, garbled at first, then increasingly clear as more stations along the relay chain confirmed what had happened. A Crintal patrol squadron, 3 vessels strong, had been moving through a stretch of contested space near a small mining outpost when a single human vessel intercepted them. Not a fleet, not a coordinated strike force. One ship, according to every account that reached us, moving with a precision that made the encounter sound less like a battle and more like a demonstration. The Crintal vessels had attempted evasive maneuvers. According to the sensor data later shared with Concord observers, they had also attempted to return fire, a fact that the Crintal hegemony would later dispute in their official statements, though the wreckage told its own story regardless of what anyone chose to say about it. Within 11 minutes, all 3 vessels had been disabled beyond any hope of continued operation, their weapons systems destroyed with what the recovered data described as surgical, almost contemptuous precision, their propulsion systems left just barely intact enough to allow the crews to limp home under their own power. No lives were lost. That detail struck me almost as hard as the engagement itself. The human vessel had disabled 3 armed warships in barely a 10th of an hour, and had done so, as far as anyone could determine, without killing a single member of their crews. It was not mercy. I understood that even then, sitting at my console with the reports scrolling past faster than I could properly absorb them. It was something colder and more deliberate than mercy. It was a message, delivered with the same careful precision that had once gone into humanity's endless apologies and careful diplomatic language, except now that precision had been turned toward an entirely different purpose, The vessel identified itself, once the engagement was complete, in a transmission that Concord monitors captured and relayed across every channel within hours. It was the Longbow. I remember staring at that name on my screen and feeling something cold settle into my chest, because I had assumed, foolishly, that the ship sitting motionless outside Halvorn Reach for the past 2 weeks had been the entirety of whatever humanity intended to do. I had not considered, until that moment, that it might have been only one piece of something far larger, something that had been quietly moving into position the entire time we were watching a single silent ship and mistaking its stillness for the whole of the story. Ethan found me in the observation deck again that night, and this time he did not wait for me to ask him anything. He simply sat down and began speaking, his voice low and steady, as though he had been carrying the words for a long time and had finally decided there was no more use in holding them back. "You want to know what changed," he said. "It wasn't the convoy, not exactly. The convoy was the last straw, but it wasn't the reason. The reason is older than that, and most of the galaxy never noticed it happening because we made sure they didn't. There used to be a rule," he said, "an old one, from back when humanity first started expanding beyond our own solar system. The rule was simple: we would extend patience to every species we met, no matter what they did to test it, for as long as that patience served a purpose. The purpose was survival, ours and everyone else's. Because the people who wrote that rule understood something the rest of the galaxy still doesn't fully understand about us." "What's that?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the stars, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped even lower, almost to a whisper. "We're not dangerous because we're aggressive," he said. "We're dangerous because we're patient, because we can watch something happen to us, over and over, and choose not to respond, for years, for decades if we have to, right up until the moment we decide the cost of continued patience is higher than the cost of finally acting. And when that moment comes, there's no gradual escalation, there's no warning shot fired to test the water, there's just a decision, made all at once, carried out completely, and it doesn't stop until whatever prompted it can no longer prompt anything at all." I thought of the 3 Crintal vessels, disabled with surgical precision, in barely 10 minutes, their crews left alive, but their capability utterly destroyed. I thought of Daniel Cole's quiet, unhurried voice in that summit chamber, saying we do not make threats, we make observations, and then we make decisions. I thought of 6 years of apologies and careful diplomatic language, and I understood, with a clarity that made my skin feel too tight across my bones, that none of it had ever been weakness. It had been the leash, held carefully, deliberately, by the very hands that could have let it go at any moment, and chose, every single day, not to. "How long," I asked, my voice barely steady, "before humanity decides the cost is high enough?" Ethan turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw something that was not quite sorrow and not quite relief, but some difficult mixture of both. "I think we already have," he said quietly. "I think the only question left is how much of the old pattern the rest of you are going to force us to walk through before you understand that." The reports continued arriving through the night, each one describing a different encounter, a different patrol squadron, a different outpost along the Kesh boundary suddenly finding itself facing a human vessel that appeared without warning, disabled every weapon system within reach, and vanished again before any meaningful counterattack could be organized. I counted 11 separate incidents by the time my shift ended, all of them following the same pattern, all of them ending the same way, with human forces demonstrating a capability that none of us had ever seen deployed, restrained behind 6 years of careful, patient silence. The Crintal hegemony's official response arrived the following day, and it carried an edge of confusion beneath its practiced hostility, the confusion of a species that had spent years testing an opponent's limits, and had never once considered that the limits might have an end. They called it an unprovoked escalation. They called it a violation of the peace that had governed the region for years. They did not, notably, call it an attack, because an attack implies casualties, implies destruction, implies the kind of violence that would justify outrage, and there was nothing in those 11 incidents that fit neatly into that category. There were only disabled ships, unharmed crews, and a pattern so precise it felt less like war and more like a lesson being administered by a teacher who had run out of patience for a student who refused to learn. The Concord Council convened an emergency session within hours, and this time Halvorn Reach was ordered to send a full report rather than simply observe, because the incidents had occurred close enough to our sector that we were now considered a party with relevant information rather than a distant witness. I sat in on the preparatory briefing alongside Taro, watching the tactical maps update in real time as more incidents were confirmed, and I remember the growing quiet in that room, the particular silence of officers who are beginning to understand that everything they believed about the balance of power in known space has just been quietly and thoroughly rewritten. "They are not trying to win a war," Taro said at one point, mostly to herself, staring at the map with an expression I could not quite read. "They're trying to make it so there's nothing left to fight over." I did not fully understand what she meant, not yet, not with the clarity I would come to have only a short while later. But I understood enough to feel the cold weight of it settle over me, the same weight I had felt in the summit chamber when Daniel Cole spoke his quiet warning to a room that had not truly believed him until it was already too late to matter. The longbow remained at its post outside Halvorn Reach through all of it, silent and motionless, weapons still live, engines still cold, watching us the way it had watched us from the very first day. I found myself wondering, as the reports continued to mount, whether it had ever truly been observing us at all, or whether it had simply been waiting, patient as ever, for the rest of its kind to finish delivering a message that had been 6 years in the making, so that it could finally, quietly, deliver whatever message had been reserved specifically for us. 3 days after the 11th incident along the Kesh boundary, Halvorn Reach received a visitor whose presence answered questions I had not yet found the courage to ask aloud. Her name was Megan Price, and she arrived aboard a small Concord archival transport, traveling under a research designation rather than a diplomatic one, which struck me as strange the moment I read her file. She had spent the last several years embedded within the joint Concord and Human Historical Exchange program, cataloging early human expansion records for the shared archive network, and according to the brief note attached to her transfer request, she had asked specifically to be reassigned to whichever station currently held the most direct observational data on the longbow. Taro granted the request without hesitation, which told me more about the severity of the moment than any briefing had managed to. Under ordinary circumstances, a civilian researcher would have waited weeks for clearance to a station under active observation status. Megan Price was granted access within a single day. I met her properly on her second morning aboard, in the small archive room tucked near the station's lower deck, surrounded by data terminals and the low hum of cooling systems. She was younger than I expected, with warm brown eyes and an unhurried way of speaking that reminded me, oddly, of the human diplomats I had known for years, except that hers carried none of the careful diplomatic restraint. She spoke plainly, the way someone speaks when they have decided that plain speech is finally the more useful currency. "You want to know what's happening," she said, before I had even finished my introduction. "Everyone does. I can't blame you. I spent 6 years reading records that most people never bothered to ask about, and even I didn't understand the full shape of it until recently." "Then help me understand it," I said. She gestured for me to sit and pulled up a set of archival records on the terminal between us, records marked with clearance levels I had never been permitted to view before. "Humanity's first serious contact with a spacefaring species wasn't gentle," she said. "It wasn't diplomatic. It happened generations before any of you ever heard of us, out past our own solar system, with a species that no longer exists in any meaningful sense today. I won't go into the details of what happened, because the details aren't the point. The point is what happened afterward, back home, once we understood what we were capable of when provoked." I asked, though some part of me already dreaded the shape of the answer. "More than we were comfortable admitting," she said quietly. "Enough that a group of our own leaders, military and civilian both, sat down together and made a decision that shaped everything that came afterward. They decided that if humanity was going to survive contact with the wider galaxy without becoming the thing every other species feared, we needed to build restraint into our expansion the way you'd build a containment field around something unstable. Not because anyone forced us to, because we understood, better than anyone else could have told us, exactly what we needed to be contained from. I thought of the endless apologies, the careful diplomatic language, the 6 years of patient, gentle behavior that had convinced an entire galaxy that humanity had simply grown past its violent origins. I thought of Ethan's words on the observation deck, the term he had used, controlled variable. It wasn't a lie, I said slowly, understanding forming in me even as I spoke it aloud. The gentleness. It wasn't performance for its own sake. No, Megan said. It was discipline, the hardest kind, because it had to hold no matter what was done to test it. Every slight absorbed without response, every insult swallowed, every provocation met with patience instead of consequence. It wasn't because we couldn't respond. It was because we had decided, as a species, that we would only respond when the alternative to responding became worse than the response itself. And the convoy, I said. That was the alternative, becoming worse. The convoy was the last data point in a pattern that had been building for years, she said. You have to understand, the Crintal hegemony wasn't the first to test us. They were simply the ones who tested us longest and hardest, because for years it worked. Every incident absorbed without visible consequence taught them that the pattern would hold indefinitely. It never occurred to them that the pattern had a threshold, because we made very sure it never occurred to them. That was the entire design. I sat with that for a long moment, the low hum of the archive room filling the silence between us, and I found myself thinking of every human officer I had ever known, every careful apology, every patient diplomatic exchange, every small kindness extended even when it was not returned, and understanding, for the first time, that all of it had been the visible surface of an enormous, deliberate restraint, held in place by people who understood exactly what lay beneath it, and had chosen, every single day, to keep it there. Why tell me this now? I asked. Why not keep it hidden, the way you've kept it hidden for so long? Megan's expression shifted, something weary and a little sad settling into her features. Because the design only works as long as the restraint holds, she said. And once it doesn't hold anymore, hiding the reason behind it only makes everyone else more afraid, not less. I'd rather the Concord understand what's happening than spend the next several months guessing at it and making the situation worse through fear. I asked, understanding? She was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the same careful weight she seemed to give everything. I think understanding rarely makes fear disappear, she said finally. But it changes what people do with the fear. A frightened Concord that doesn't understand humanity might try to isolate us, contain us, treat us the way you'd treat something dangerous and incomprehensible. A frightened Concord that does understand us might instead ask the only question that actually matters right now. What question is that? What would it take, she said, to give humanity a reason to pick the leash back up? I did not have an answer for her, and I do not think she expected one from me. I was, after all, only a communications officer on a small listening post, not a member of the council with any authority to shape the answer she was describing. But her words stayed with me long after she returned to her archive terminal, long after I returned to my own post, because they framed the entire crisis in a way nothing else had managed to. We had spent 6 years believing humanity's gentleness was a destination, an arrival point at the end of a long evolutionary road, the same story every species told itself about its own growing wisdom. We had never considered that it might instead be a choice, renewed every single day, requiring effort and discipline that most of us would never have been capable of sustaining, even for a single week, let alone across the vast, patient span of years humanity had managed it. I began, in the days that followed, to notice details I had overlooked before, small things that took on new weight now that I understood the shape of what lay beneath them, the way human officers on the station always positioned themselves near exits during meetings, not out of nervousness, but out of habit so old it had become invisible even to them. The way Ethan, in all the months I had known him, had never once raised his voice, even during the tense arguments that occasionally broke out over shared duty rosters, and how I had mistaken that calm for an absence of passion rather than the presence of something carefully governed. I thought of an incident from nearly a year earlier, one I had witnessed firsthand and filed away without much thought at the time. A minor reactor fault had triggered a containment breach warning in one of the station's lower maintenance shafts, and a young human engineer named Daniel had been the first to respond, moving into the affected section without hesitation, working calmly through a procedure that could have ended in his death if he made even a single mistake, his hands steady the entire time, his voice level as he spoke instructions to the rest of us over the comm. I remembered thinking, at the time, that his calm was admirable. I understood now that it had not been admirable in the way I assumed. It had been ordinary, for him, the same quiet discipline that governed every other part of his behavior, simply applied to a moment where most other species would have panicked. We had been living alongside an extraordinary species for years, I realized, and we had mistaken its extraordinary nature for something ordinary, because it had been presented to us wrapped so carefully in patience and apology that we never once thought to look beneath the wrapping. I did not know, sitting in that archive room with Megan Price's quiet words still settling over me, that the wrapping had already begun to come apart in earnest, far beyond the reach of our sensors, in places where humanity's patience had finally, completely, run its course. I did not know that the 11 incidents along the Kesh boundary had been only the opening measure of something far larger, something that was, even as we spoke, beginning to move across the width of contested space with a quiet, terrible momentum that nothing in Concord doctrine had ever prepared any of us to face. I would learn soon enough, we all would, and by the time we did, there would be no question left of whether humanity's restraint had been real. There would only be the question of what remained once that restraint had finally, completely, been set aside. The first true wave began at a time that later analysis would place at almost exactly midnight by the old Concord calendar, though at the time none of us understood, we were watching the opening moment of something that would reshape the balance of the entire sector within a matter of days. I was not on duty when it started. I was asleep, or trying to be, in my narrow quarters, when the station's general alert system tore me out of whatever thin rest I had managed to find. By the time I reached the bridge, still fastening the last clasp of my uniform, the tactical display was already a chaos of shifting markers, red and grey symbols blooming and vanishing across a section of the map that represented nearly a quarter of the contested Crintal frontier. Tero stood at the center of it all, her hands braced against the main console, her eyes fixed on the display with an intensity that made the rest of the bridge crew move in careful, hushed silence around her. "Report," she said, without turning. The junior tactical officer, Corin, answered in a voice that shook only slightly. "Multiple simultaneous human incursions across the entire Kesh boundary corridor, Commander. Confirmed engagements at 11 separate Crintal installations so far, with more contacts registering every few minutes. It's not one fleet, it's dozens of individual vessels, moving independently, hitting targets in a pattern I can't identify." "Casualties?" Taro asked. Corin hesitated, scrolling through data that seemed to update faster than he could read it. "Minimal on the Crintal side, as far as we can tell, Commander. Heavy material losses. Every installation hit has had its weapons and defense systems disabled, sometimes within minutes of first contact. But confirmed loss of life appears to be limited." I felt something loosen slightly in my chest at that, a small, foolish hope that perhaps this would remain the same careful, restrained pattern we had witnessed before, disabling rather than destroying, precision rather than annihilation. That hope did not survive the next several hours. The reports continued arriving in waves of their own, each one describing a scale of coordinated action that seemed impossible given how quietly it had all been assembled. Human vessels appeared at supply depots deep within Crintal territory, vessels that should not have been able to reach those positions without weeks of advance movement that our sensor networks would have detected. They struck not at population centers, not at the places where destruction would have been easiest and most devastating, but at the narrow, precise points where Crintal military capability depended most heavily on continued function: fuel depots, shipyards mid-construction, communication relays that coordinated fleet movements across dozens of systems. It was not war in the shape I had been trained to recognize war. There was no grand battle, no clash of fleets meeting in open space to determine the outcome through overwhelming force. It was something colder and more methodical, a series of small, precise removals carried out with a coordination that suggested every ship involved had known exactly what it needed to do and had simply been waiting, patiently, for the signal to begin doing it. "They're not trying to defeat them," Megan Price said. She had come to the bridge sometime during the chaos, standing quietly near the back of the room, watching the display with an expression that held more sorrow than surprise. "They're removing the ability to continue. There's a difference, and it matters more than anyone here probably realizes yet." "Explain," Taro said, not unkindly, though her voice carried the strain of someone holding herself together through sheer discipline. "A war fought to defeat an enemy ends when the enemy surrenders, or when one side runs out of the will to keep fighting," Megan said. "This isn't that. This is a war fought to remove capability. It ends when there's nothing left with which to continue the pattern that caused it in the first place. It's slower to look at, from the outside, but it's far more permanent." I watched the display for the rest of that night, and for most of the following day, as the pattern continued to unfold with a terrible, patient consistency. Crintal fleet movements, once so confident and unpredictable, became suddenly cautious, then desperate, then increasingly rare, as installation after installation reported the same story. A single vessel, or sometimes two, arriving without warning, disabling every weapon and defense system within reach, and departing before any meaningful counterforce could be assembled, leaving behind crews unharmed but utterly stripped of the ability to continue their work. The Crintal hegemony attempted, on the second day, a coordinated counterattack, gathering what remained of their mobile fleet strength into a single-massed formation meant to overwhelm whatever human forces they could locate through sheer numbers. I remember watching the tactical projections of that formation moving across the display, remember the tight, hopeful silence on our own bridge, as officers who had spent days watching humanity's advance wondered whether this might finally be the moment the pattern broke in the other direction. It did not break. The formation encountered a human presence at the coordinates where Crintal Command believed a critical supply route could be defended, and within under 2 hours, that formation ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Not through overwhelming firepower, not through some devastating weapon that erased ships from existence in an instant, but through a systematic, almost administrative dismantling of its capacity to fight, ship by ship, until what remained was scattered, disabled, and utterly without direction. I remember Ethan finding me on the observation deck again during those long, strange days, and this time neither of us spoke for a long while, simply sitting together in silence, watching the same unchanging stars that had witnessed everything without ever once betraying what any of it meant to them. "Is it always like this?" I finally asked, "when your restraint finally ends?" He considered the question for a long moment before answering, his eyes distant, fixed on something far beyond the viewport in front of us. "I've read about it," he said. "I've never seen it, not like this, not in my own lifetime. But I've read the old records. It's always the same shape, whenever it happens. No anger you can see from the outside. No cruelty, not in the way most species understand cruelty. Just an ending, carried out completely, because we've learned the hard way that anything less than complete just becomes another beginning." "And after," I said, "what happens after it ends?" He turned to look at me then, and for the first time in weeks, something like the old warmth I remembered from him flickered briefly across his features, tired and worn, but still, somehow, present beneath everything else. "After we go back to being the people you thought you knew," he said. "That part was never the lie. The gentleness is real. It's just not the whole truth, the way most truths aren't the whole truth when you first learn them. It's a choice we make every day, and most days, it's an easy choice to make. This is what happens on the rare day it stops being easy. I did not sleep much during those days, and I do not think I was alone in that across the station. The mood aboard Halvorn Reach had shifted into something I had never experienced before in all my years of service, a strange combination of dread and awe that left conversations shorter, quieter, more careful than usual, as though everyone aboard understood, without needing to say it aloud, that we were witnessing something that would be studied and argued over for generations to come, long after every one of us had left this posting behind. By the fourth day, the reports from the Kesh boundary corridor had slowed, not because the pattern had ended, but because there was increasingly little left for the pattern to be applied to. Crintal military installations across the region reported, one after another, the same quiet, humiliating story: weapons disabled, defenses stripped, fleets scattered and rendered incapable of coordinated action, and through all of it, remarkably, almost impossibly, the casualty reports remained low, a fact that Megan Price found more unsettling than comforting when she mentioned it to me during one of our increasingly frequent conversations in the archive room. "They're being careful," she said, "even now, even at the height of it. That's not an accident. That's discipline holding, even under maximum strain. I don't know if that should make us feel better or worse about what we're watching." I did not know either. I only knew that somewhere in the vast dark beyond our sensor range, an entire species that the galaxy had spent years mistaking for gentle, had finally, briefly, allowed itself to become what it had always been capable of becoming, and had done so with a precision so complete that it left almost no room to argue against what would inevitably follow. The Crintal hegemony formally requested a ceasefire on the seventh day, and the request reached us at Halvorn Reach through the same Concord relay network that had carried every piece of this unfolding crisis, though this time the tone of the message was unlike anything I had read from them before. Gone was the practiced arrogance of Vosk Ren at the summit, the mandibles clicking with amusement, the casual dismissal of evidence that contradicted their version of events. What arrived instead was something closer to plain, unadorned fear, dressed in the careful language of formal surrender. I read the message twice before I fully believed it. The hegemony offered full reparations for the convoy incident. They offered an independent Concord tribunal with unrestricted access to their military records. They offered, remarkably, a formal apology, the first I had ever seen from them in all my years of monitoring their communications, an apology written in language so careful and so thorough that it read almost like a species trying to relearn, in real time, a form of speech it had never before needed to use. What they did not receive, in return, was a response. I want to describe this carefully, because it was perhaps the strangest part of the entire crisis, stranger even than the disabling of entire fleets, or the quiet, methodical dismantling of military capability across a quarter of contested space. Humanity did not answer the ceasefire request, not with acceptance, not with refusal, not with counter-demands or additional conditions or any of the familiar diplomatic maneuvering that every species in Concord space had learned to expect from negotiations of this kind. The channels the Crintal hegemony used to send their requests simply received no reply at all, and the silence stretched on for so long that it became, in its own way, more devastating than any answer could have been. "They're not negotiating," Megan Price said, when I brought the situation to her in the archive room, hoping she might have some insight the rest of us lacked. "You don't negotiate with something you've already decided isn't a threat anymore. You just stop paying attention to it." "That seems almost crueler than continuing to fight," I said. She considered that for a long moment, turning a datapad over in her hands without really looking at it. "I think, from a human perspective, it might be the opposite of cruelty," she said finally. "Cruelty requires attention. It requires caring enough about the other party to want them to suffer for what they did. What you're describing sounds more like indifference, and indifference, as strange as it sounds, might actually be the kindest thing left available once the pattern has run its course." I did not fully understand what she meant until the 8th day, when a new transmission reached Halvorn Reach, this one addressed not to the Crintal hegemony, but directly to the Concord Council, and copied, for reasons that were not immediately clear to me, to every listening post along the frontier, including our own. It was Laura Bennett's voice this time, calm and measured, reading from what sounded like an official statement rather than speaking freely, though there was a weariness beneath the careful diplomatic tone that had not been there during the summit weeks earlier. To the Concord Council and all observing parties, she said, humanity considers the immediate matter of the Kesh boundary corridor resolved. We will not be pursuing further military action against Crintal hegemony assets at this time, provided no further provocation occurs. We will also not be engaging with any Crintal request for continued dialogue regarding the events of the past 8 days. We consider the matter closed, and we consider our position on future incidents of this nature to have been made sufficiently clear through demonstrated action rather than repeated warning. The message ended there, without further elaboration, without the customary diplomatic closing statements that usually softened even the hardest pronouncements. I remember sitting in the communications bay long after the transmission ended, turning the words over in my mind, trying to understand the strange, cold finality of them. They had not asked for an apology, though one had been offered. They had not demanded reparations, though reparations had been promised. They had simply stated, plainly and without further negotiation, that the matter was closed, and in doing so, they had removed from the Crintal hegemony the one thing every species in Concord space relied upon to make sense of conflict, the opportunity to be forgiven through effort. There would be no path back to good standing through continued diplomatic engagement, because humanity had simply stopped considering that engagement worth their attention. Taro called a final briefing 3 days later, once it became clear that the pattern truly had ended, that no further incidents were occurring along the Kesh boundary, that the human vessels which had moved through the region with such terrible precision had simply withdrawn, quietly, without ceremony, back toward whatever positions they had come from. The Council wants our full assessment, she told the assembled bridge crew, her voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent the better part of 2 weeks watching something reshape the fundamental assumptions of everything she had been trained to understand. They want to know what this means for humanity's status within the Concord going forward. What do we tell them? Corin asked, and I could hear, beneath the professional tone of the question, the same uncertainty that had settled over all of us in the days since the crisis began. Taro was quiet for a long moment before she answered, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried none of the confident authority I had grown used to hearing from her. I don't know, she admitted. I've spent my entire career believing I understood the shape of every species we've encountered, aggressive ones, cautious ones that hide their true nature behind careful diplomacy, for reasons of their own. I don't think I understand humanity at all anymore. I think I understand them less now than I did before any of this happened, and I think that might be the truest thing I can tell the Council. I found Ethan in the mess hall that evening, sitting alone at the same table where he had first told me the words that had haunted me for weeks. We already asked nicely 3 times. I sat down across from him without a word, and for a long while neither of us spoke, the low hum of the station's systems filling the silence between us. Is it over? I finally asked. The part of you that had to be like that? He looked up at me, and something in his expression had softened since the last time I had seen him, the terrible weight behind his eyes, replaced by something closer to the tired relief of a man setting down a burden he had carried for far longer than anyone should have to. It's over, he said quietly, for now. It always goes back to sleep, once it's done what it needed to do. That's the part nobody outside ever quite believes, until they've seen it happen more than once. How do you live with it? I asked, knowing it's there, even when it's sleeping. He was quiet for a long time before he answered, turning his cup of coffee slowly in his hands, the same gesture I remembered from the very first conversation we had ever had about any of this. The same way anyone lives with carrying something dangerous, he said finally. Carefully, deliberately, and with enough respect for what it can do that you never let yourself forget why you keep it asleep in the first place. I did not have an answer for that, and I do not think he expected one from me. We sat together for a long while longer, saying little else, and for the first time in weeks, the silence between us felt like something closer to peace than to dread, though I understood, even then, that the peace was fragile, borrowed against a future none of us could fully predict, resting on the same quiet, deliberate discipline that had made it possible in the first place. The Concord Council reconvened a full session nearly a month after the last incident along the Kesh boundary, and this time the invitation extended to Halvorn Reach, included Commander Taro, myself, and Megan Price, a fact that told me, more clearly than any briefing could have, how seriously the Council had come to regard our small station's accumulated observations of the entire crisis. Sindral Station looked much the same as it had during the earlier summit, its patchwork architecture unchanged, its corridors filled with the same mixture of species going about business that had, on the surface, returned to something resembling normal, but the atmosphere inside the main chamber was entirely different from what I remembered. Where there had once been the practiced confidence of a council accustomed to sitting in judgment over the disputes of younger species, there was now something more careful, more measured, an unmistakable undercurrent of caution in the way the Velmiri elders addressed the human delegation that arrived for this session. Laura Bennett led that delegation again, though this time Daniel Cole stood beside her rather than at the back of the room, and I noticed, watching him take his place, that something in his bearing had changed since the summit weeks earlier. The tightly wound stillness I remembered, the sense of a bowstring drawn back and waiting, had eased into something quieter, more settled, the posture of a man who had set down a weight he had carried for a long time and had not yet fully adjusted to its absence. Ail Sorinth opened the session, and her voice, usually so measured and composed, carried a faint but unmistakable tremor beneath its careful diplomatic phrasing. "The Council wishes to formally acknowledge the events of the past month," she began, "and to express our recognition that certain assumptions regarding humanity's position within the Concord may require reconsideration." I watched Bennett's face as she listened, and I saw none of the vindication I might have expected, none of the satisfaction of a species finally being taken seriously after years of quiet frustration. What I saw instead was simple, unadorned weariness, the particular exhaustion of someone who had hoped, for a very long time, that this moment would never need to arrive. "We appreciate the Council's recognition," Bennett said, when it was her turn to speak. "We would like to be equally clear about what that recognition should and should not imply going forward." "Please," Ael Sorinth said, "the Council is listening." Bennett glanced briefly toward Daniel Cole before continuing, and something passed between them that I could not quite read, though I understood, even from a distance, that it carried the weight of a decision they had made together long before this session began. "Humanity did not enjoy what became necessary these past weeks," Bennett said. "I want that understood clearly, and I want it understood without qualification. Every measure taken was measured precisely because we understand, better than perhaps any species in this chamber, exactly how far things could have gone had we chosen differently. We chose the narrowest path available to us, that still accomplished what needed to be accomplished. We do not consider that a victory, we consider it a failure of every diplomatic effort that came before it." The chamber was silent at that, and I found myself thinking of Ethan's words on the observation deck, weeks earlier, when he had told me that humanity's gentleness was not a lie, only an incomplete truth. I understood now, watching Bennett speak, that this too was part of the same incomplete truth, laid bare in front of an audience finally prepared to hear it in full. "What we would ask of this Council," Bennett continued, "is not congratulation, and not further apology on behalf of parties who have already offered their own. What we would ask is a genuine effort, going forward, to address grievances before they accumulate to the point where a species feels it has no remaining option but to demonstrate, rather than explain, the consequences of continued provocation. We do not wish to be the measure by which other species learn the cost of pushing too far. We would very much prefer to go back to being, as one of your own council members once put it, the tame ones." A faint, uncomfortable ripple moved through the chamber at that phrase, and I understood, from the way several council members shifted in their seats, that the old joke, the one we had once shared so freely in mess halls and briefing rooms across Concord space, no longer felt like a joke to anyone who had witnessed what lay beneath it. Daniel Cole spoke only once during that session, near its conclusion, when Ael Sorinth asked whether humanity intended to maintain a heightened military posture along the frontier going forward. "No," he said simply. we intend to go back to exactly what we were before this happened. Patient, careful, willing to absorb far more than most species would consider reasonable, because we understand, perhaps better than anyone else in this chamber, the value of that patience when it holds. We would simply ask that the rest of you understand, now, what it costs everyone involved when it doesn't. The session ended not long after that, without the grand declarations or sweeping policy changes I had half expected, and I found myself surprised by how quiet the resolution felt, how understated, given the scale of everything that had led to it. There were no treaties signed with great ceremony. There was no formal restructuring of humanity's status within the Concord. There was only a shared, unspoken understanding, settling over the chamber like dust after a long storm, that something fundamental had shifted, and that it would not be forgotten by anyone who had been present to witness it. I spoke with Ethan one final time before I returned to Halvorn Reach, standing together near the transport bay of Sindral Station, the same patchwork architecture stretching around us in silence. "Do you think it's really over?" I asked him, "the way they said it was?" "For now," he said, "it always is, for now. That's the honest answer, and I think it's the only honest answer any of us can give you. We'll go back to apologizing too much, and filling out forms in triplicate, and letting small things go, that other species probably wouldn't let go. And most of the time, that will be the whole truth, exactly the way you always believed it to be. And the rest of the time?" He smiled, faintly, the first real smile I had seen from him in weeks, though something old and careful still lingered behind it. "The rest of the time," he said, "is the part we hope you never have to see again. But if you ever do, I'd rather you understand what you're looking at than spend that time being surprised by it, the way everyone was this time." I thought about his words for a long while after I returned to my post at Halvorn Reach, watching the same unchanging stars I had watched every night since the longbow first arrived, though the ship itself had long since withdrawn, returning to whatever quiet posting it had come from before all of this began. I thought about 6 years of careful, patient gentleness, and about the 8 days that had followed it, and about the strange, uncomfortable truth that both of those things had been equally real, equally sincere, two faces of the same species, held together by a discipline I doubted I would ever fully understand, no matter how long I studied it. The galaxy did not forget what it had learned during those 8 days, though it did, in time, grow comfortable again, the way every living thing eventually grows comfortable even with memories that once terrified it. Trade routes reopened, diplomatic exchanges resumed their familiar, careful rhythms. Humanity returned, exactly as promised, to its patient, apologetic ways, filling out forms in triplicate, extending courtesy even where courtesy was not returned, becoming once again the species that every other species in Concord space, quietly, fondly, mistakenly referred to as the gentle ones. But I never forgot, not for the rest of my career, the particular stillness in Daniel Cole's voice as he stood before the council and told them, without raising his tone even once, that civilization, for humanity, had never been a limitation forced upon them by weakness or by the watchful eyes of others. It had always been a choice, renewed quietly every single day, held in place by hands strong enough to set it down entirely whenever the cost of holding it grew too high. And somewhere, in the quiet space between the stars, I understood that the rest of us had been given something rare and difficult to carry forward from all of it. Not fear, exactly, though fear was certainly part of it. Something closer to respect, the old, careful kind, the kind you offer to something that could have taken far more from you than it ever chose to, and chose, in the end, to give it back instead.